I said it was a joint celebration, a birthday for me, an engagement party for Sophia. One evening, 2 milestones, one family coming together. I believed them. I wore my best dress. I bought flowers for the table. I stood in the middle of our living room, heart wide open, waiting for a moment that would stitch something broken between us back together. Instead, they handed me an envelope and a smile and told me it was time to go. I smiled back. They thought they were ending something. They didn't realize they were setting me free. The envelope was pale pink, the kind you'd expect to hold a love letter or an invitation. Not a notice, not a demand, not the kind of thing that ripped out your roots and dropped them at your feet. I opened it with careful fingers, the laughter and music swirling around me like smoke. The words inside were clinical, almost tender in their cruelty. Request for immediate relocation. Effective within 30 days. Mutual agreement encouraged. I blinked once, slowly, the paper blurring into soft edges. Sophia giggled nearby, the sound bright and careless. Mom refilled wine glasses with a practiced flick of her wrist. Dad clapped someone on the back, already turning away from me. They didn't see my hands shake. They didn't care to. I folded the letter neatly, tucking it back into its envelope. I placed it on the nearest side table, right between a half-eaten slice of cake and a stack of congratulatory cards for Sophia. I straightened my dress, smoothed my hair, and smiled. When Mom leaned over, squeezing my shoulder, she said it like a favor. "This is for the best, honey. You need to find your own path." Dad chimed in, slurring slightly from too much champagne. "You're strong, Eva. You'll land on your feet." Sophia just beamed, adjusting the diamond ring that caught every flicker of light like a crown she believed she deserved more than air. I stood there, letting their words wrap around me like winter winds, sharp, invisible, final. I nodded. I thanked them. I toasted Sophia with a glass of sparkling water because I hadn't been offered champagne. I laughed at their jokes. I posed for pictures, my arm around Sophia's shoulder, the envelope peeking out of my purse like a ghost. They thought I would cry later. They thought I would beg. They thought I would slip out of their lives quietly, the way forgotten things do. They didn't know about the letter tucked away in my bedroom drawer, written in my grandmother's careful hand. They didn't know about the notarized document that made me an equal owner of this house. They didn't know that when they sold off my room to pay for Sophia's dream wedding, they were selling something that wasn't fully theirs to give. And I wasn't about to remind them, not yet. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud. It isn't messy. It doesn't come with slammed doors or shouted accusations. Sometimes it's standing still while the people who thought they held all the cards realize too late that the deck was never in their favor. Sometimes it's knowing you don't have to prove anything. You just have to survive long enough to watch them drown in their own illusion. I slipped away from the party early, unnoticed. The night air was cold against my skin, biting through the thin fabric of my dress. I didn't shiver. I didn't cry. I walked down the sidewalk slowly, heels clicking against the cracked pavement, every step carving a little more distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. I passed the old oak tree where Sophia and I used to build forts out of fallen branches. I passed the rusted swing set Dad never got around to fixing. I passed every silent memory, every place that had taught me loyalty meant swallowing your own hurt for the comfort of others. I reached the corner, turned once to look back at the house glowing with fairy lights and lies, and smiled again. It wasn't the bitter smile of someone plotting revenge. It was the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had finally realized she didn't need permission to leave. She didn't need permission to fight. She didn't need permission to win. They had given me the greatest gift they could without ever meaning to. They had set me free, and I wasn't going back. The next morning, the house smelled like stale champagne and cold pizza. Sophia was already gone, whisked away by her fiancé for a weekend getaway to celebrate new beginnings, according to the note she left taped to the fridge. Mom and Dad moved around the kitchen with forced casualness, pretending everything was normal, pretending the envelope tucked into my purse didn't exist. I sat at the table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching them pretend. The sunlight through the window was too bright, too sharp, cutting through every polite lie floating between us. Dad cleared his throat, glancing at me over the newspaper. "Got any plans yet, kiddo?" he asked, his voice artificially cheerful. Mom busied herself, stacking dishes, not meeting my eyes. I smiled into my coffee cup. "Not yet," I said. "I'm thinking about it." The words were light, harmless on the surface, but they carried a weight none of us acknowledged. They thought they had all the power. They thought this was the final move. They didn't know the game had shifted without them noticing. After breakfast, I went upstairs to my old room. The walls were bare, the furniture thinned out to essentials: bed, dresser, a lamp with a flickering bulb. They had been preparing for this long before the envelope arrived. I sat on the bed and pulled the letter from my grandmother out of the bottom drawer, unfolding it carefully, smoothing the creases with hands that didn't tremble. Her handwriting was still steady, still elegant, even after all these years. "To my granddaughter Eva," it read, "half of what I built is yours. No matter what they say, no matter how they try to change the story." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle into the hollow places inside me that had been carved out by years of being second best. I thought about the afternoons spent baking with her in this very kitchen, about the way she slipped me $20 bills and whispered, "For dreams too big to fit in this house." I thought about the way she always made space for me when no one else did, and now, even gone, she had left me one final shield. I spent the day quietly packing a few things: books, photographs, the quilt my grandmother made by hand the year I was born. I moved slowly, methodically, letting Mom and Dad think I was preparing to leave like a good daughter should. I let them breathe easier. I let them believe their plan was working. Meanwhile, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer downtown, a woman named Miss Carter who specialized in property disputes and family betrayal. When I explained the situation, she nodded once, sharp and sure, like she had seen it 1,000 times before. "You have standing," she said. "If the deed includes your name, they can't sell the property without your consent, and they certainly can't evict you without cause." I exhaled slowly, the knot in my chest loosening for the first time in days. "Good," I said, "because I'm not going anywhere." Mrs. Carter smiled, a fierce, proud thing. "Let's make sure they understand that." I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I let the days slide by in a haze of fake smiles and polite nods. Mom asked if I needed help looking for apartments. Dad left pamphlets for budget movers on the kitchen counter like breadcrumbs leading out of their lives. I took it all in with a kind of detached amusement, stacking their assumptions like cards in a flimsy house I knew would fall with the lightest touch. Sophia sent texts filled with wedding plans and honeymoon destinations, never mentioning the party, never mentioning me. Each night, I sat at my old desk, sorting through documents, old letters, anything that might strengthen my claim. Ms. Carter was thorough. She requested copies of the original deed, the notarized letters, the property tax records. Everything pointed to one unshakable fact: I wasn't a guest in this house. I was an owner. I had rights they had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Maybe they thought I wouldn't fight. Maybe they thought I didn't know how. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They always had. The night before my meeting with Ms. Carter to officially file the notice of dispute, Mom knocked on my door. She hovered in the hallway, holding 2 mugs of tea like a peace offering. I gestured her in, curious what last-minute guilt might sound like when brewed into Earl Grey. She sat across from me, smoothing her skirt over her knees, her eyes darting everywhere but my face. "I hope you know," she began, her voice too soft, too careful. "This isn't personal. We have to think about the future. Sophia needs the support. This house, selling it, it's the best way to help her start her new life." I nodded slowly, pretending to consider her words. "Of course," I said, my voice even. "You're just doing what you think is best." Relief flickered across her face, so quick it almost made me pity her. Almost. We drank our tea in silence, the weight of everything unsaid settling between us like fog. When she finally left, closing the door with a soft click, I poured the tea down the drain. I didn't need their comfort. I didn't need their approval. I needed only one thing now: to reclaim what was mine and to build a life they would never again have the power to touch. The morning of the legal filing, the sky hung low and heavy, as if even the weather could feel the weight of what was about to shift. I dressed carefully, pulling on a navy blazer I hadn't worn since my last failed job interview, brushing imaginary lint from the sleeves with slow, deliberate hands. Sophie, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath our roof, sent a quick text about cake flavors and bridesmaid dresses, adding a flurry of heart emojis like sprinkles over the wound. I caught the bus downtown, letting the rumble of the engine settle the knots in my stomach. Miss Carter's office was small but efficient, lined with certificates and framed photos of victorious clients shaking her hand. She greeted me with a smile that was all business and zero doubt. We reviewed the documents one last time, dotted the final I's, crossed the final T's, then slid the thick stack across the polished table for my signature. "You're ready for this," Ms. Carter said simply, not as encouragement but as a statement of fact. I nodded once, the weight of that truth settling over me like armor. With a slow breath, I signed my name, binding my future to a path I had chosen for myself. No more waiting for permission, no more hoping they would see my worth. No more shrinking to fit a family portrait I no longer belonged in. We filed the papers with the county clerk, a legal freeze on any attempts to sell the property without my consent, an official notice to Mom and Dad: the house wasn't theirs to bargain with. As we stepped out into the brisk afternoon air, I felt lighter, as if every step away from that courthouse was a step toward a life they couldn't erase with a smile and a glass of cheap champagne. That night, I didn't say a word about the filing. I ate dinner at the kitchen counter while Dad grumbled over bills and Mom scrolled through wedding websites on her tablet. Sophia video called to show off her latest dress fitting, twirling in satin and lace while the rest of us clapped dutifully on the screen. I watched it all from a distance, like observing a play where the ending had already been written, and I wasn't the tragic character anymore. Upstairs, I lay awake long after the house had settled into uneasy quiet. The ceiling fan spun lazy circles overhead, stirring the warm summer air. I thought about the moment when they would realize the truth, when the realtor called to say the sale couldn't go through, when the paperwork hit the table and their carefully laid plans unraveled stitch by stitch. I didn't smile at the thought. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something quieter, sadder, but no less certain. I wasn't fighting to hurt them. I was fighting to save myself. And for the first time in my life, I was winning. 3 days later, it happened. I came downstairs to find Mom pacing the kitchen, a realtor on speakerphone rattling off apologies and legal jargon she clearly didn't understand. Dad sat slumped at the table, face red and hands trembling as he clutched a copy of the notice Miss Carter had filed. Their voices blurred into a single note of panic that rose and fell like a siren. They didn't see me at first, standing in the doorway with my arms crossed, watching the empire they had built on silence and assumption start to crumble. Mom finally noticed me and rushed forward, waving the notice in the air. "Ava, what is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You filed a claim against the sale? You can't do this. You're ruining everything." I met her fury with a calm I didn't know I was capable of. "I'm protecting what's mine," I said simply, each word landing like a hammer. "Grandma made sure I had a stake in this house. You just hoped I wouldn't know it." Dad pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loud against the floor. "You're being selfish," he spat. "This is Sophia's future you're jeopardizing." I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds no warmth, only truth. "Funny," I said. "You didn't seem worried about my future when you handed me that eviction notice." They spluttered, searching for words that would reshape reality into something more convenient. But there was nothing left to say. The paperwork was filed, the law was on my side, and for once, so was time. I turned away from them, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. "I have a meeting," I said. "Don't wait up." I drove to the park on the edge of town, the one where Grandma used to take me when the house got too loud, too heavy. I sat on a bench worn smooth by years of other people's prayers and regrets, and watched the sun slide down the horizon, staining the sky in shades of fire and forgiveness. I pulled the letter from Grandma out of my purse and reread it under the fading light. "I believe in you, Eva," it said. "I always have." Tears blurred the words, but I let them fall, not out of sadness, out of gratitude. Because she had seen me when no one else did. Because she had planted a seed that grew into something none of them could uproot. Because I had finally become the person she had always known I could be. As the stars began to prick the darkening sky, I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my purse. I stood up, brushing dust from my jeans, and turned toward home. Not the house. The home I had built inside myself, brick by brick, breath by breath. And this time, no one was taking it from me. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Mom barely spoke to me, her movements clipped and sharp around the kitchen, as if the clatter of dishes could fill the space between us. Dad stayed in the garage, tinkering with tools he hadn't touched in years, pretending he could hammer things back into the shape he wanted them to be. Sophia didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask why the sale had fallen through, or why the plans for her perfect beginning were unraveling thread by golden thread. I went about my life like nothing had changed, because for me, it hadn't. I still brewed my morning coffee. Bill sat on the back porch in the early light, reading books Grandma had once pressed into my hands. Bill walked to the little community center on Main Street where I volunteered on weekends, teaching kids whose dreams had never been given permission to grow. One evening, as I was sorting canned goods at the food drive, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something inside me said, "Face it, finish it." I answered with a steady voice, bracing for another desperate plea disguised as concern. Instead, Sophia's voice spilled through the line, brittle and breathless. "Eva, I heard what you did. You froze the sale. Why would you do this to me? To Mom and Dad?" she demanded, her words laced with the kind of entitlement that had always been easier for her to wear than honesty. I leaned against the metal shelving, letting her accusations wash over me like rain on stone. "I didn't do anything to you," I said quietly. "I protected what's mine." There was a long pause, the static between us thicker than any anger. Then Sophia's voice cracked, smaller now, almost childlike. "You ruined everything." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the old ache of guilt rise, and then let it go. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You just finally had to live in a world you couldn't control." I hung up before she could answer, slipping my phone into my pocket like shutting a door that had been swinging open too long. At home, Mom waited in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch like a bird afraid of being caged. She didn't look up as I entered. She just said, her voice flat, "Your father and I are reconsidering our plans." I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't need to. I just nodded, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table like I had every night for the last 27 years. But inside, I knew. The ground had shifted. The story they thought they were writing, the one where I faded out gracefully, was no longer theirs to finish. The weeks that followed were a quiet war. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just the slow, grinding realization that their plans no longer held weight over me. I became a ghost in the house they had once ruled with smiles and subtle punishments. I moved through the kitchen like a tenant rather than a daughter, packed lunches in silence, left early for work, returned late without explanations. They didn't ask where I went. They didn't ask anything at all. Silence had become their last weapon, and even it was starting to dull. I focused on building a future they couldn't touch. I took extra shifts at the community center, saved every dollar I could, started researching affordable apartments downtown just in case the standoff pushed harder than I expected. I didn't want to stay in the house forever. I didn't need to cling to bricks and beams soaked in old betrayals, but I wasn't leaving on their terms. I wasn't leaving so they could sell the pieces of my childhood to fund Sophia's fairy tale. One evening, as I balanced ledgers behind the donation counter, Mrs. Alvarez, the center's director, peeked her head into the office. "There's someone here to see you," she said gently. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped into the hallway. And there stood Sophia. No makeup, no carefully curated Instagram glow. Just my sister, looking small and tired and more human than I had seen her in years. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. I didn't move closer. I didn't invite her in. "Sorry for what?" I asked, letting her twist in the silence. She swallowed hard. "For taking everything for granted. For not standing up for you. For letting them push you out while I stood there and smiled." Her apology hung between us like a thread, fragile and fraying. Part of me wanted to step forward, to erase the years of hurt with a hug and a whispered, "It's okay." But most of me, the part that had grown roots deep enough to withstand storms, knew better. Some wounds aren't healed by apologies. They're healed by time and distance, and the quiet rebuilding of trust, brick by brick, if they're healed at all. I nodded once, slow and measured. "I'm glad you realize it, but realizing it doesn't erase it." Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I let them fall if they needed to. I wasn't here to catch them anymore. Sophia didn't say anything else. She just nodded, wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater, and turned away. Her shoulders hunched, like she was carrying a weight she hadn't been strong enough to notice before. I watched her walk back down the cracked sidewalk, disappearing into the heavy dusk like a ghost retreating into a story that no longer needed my participation. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt free. At home, Mom and Dad pretended not to notice Sophia's visit. They moved through the house like players sticking to a script that no longer made sense, speaking in clipped sentences about weather and grocery lists, as if small talk could sew up the gaping holes between us. I let them. I answered when necessary, nodded politely when required, but gave them nothing else. No anger, no forgiveness, no opening for them to rewrite the past. Meanwhile, I started planning my future more aggressively. I applied for a scholarship at a community college downtown, majoring in nonprofit management. I figured if I was already rebuilding lives at the center, I might as well rebuild my own too. I emailed Miss Carter, thanking her again for her work and asking for advice about securing my financial share of the house when, the sale inevitably collapsed without my consent. She responded within an hour, sharp and efficient. "You're holding all the cards. Let them realize it slowly." And they did. Slowly. Painfully. The day the second buyer backed out after discovering the title dispute, Dad exploded in the kitchen, slamming a fist into the countertop hard enough to rattle the silverware. I sat at the table sipping my coffee, calm as a quiet storm. Mom tried to soothe him with empty words about other options and being patient, but the truth was bleeding through their seams now, undeniable and raw. They needed my cooperation to sell, and I had no intention of giving it. Sophia sent another message later that night. "I'm sorry it took losing everything to see you." I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the sadness of it settle in my chest. Sadness for the girl she had been. Sadness for the sisterhood we had lost. But not sadness for myself. I had learned long ago that surviving betrayal meant carving out a place where forgiveness wasn't required for healing. It meant choosing peace over reopening wounds. It meant closing some doors gently but firmly. And that's exactly what I was doing. The official decision came a few weeks later. The realtor sent a terse email informing Mom and Dad that without unanimous consent from all property owners, the sale could not proceed. No loopholes, no last-minute fixes. Their dream of cashing in on the house to fund Sophia's wedding, or whatever fantasy they had spun, was over. They didn't confront me directly. They didn't apologize. They just withdrew. Conversations became shorter, thinner, stretched taut with all the things they refused to say. Dad spent hours in the garage, pretending to fix a lawnmower that had been broken since I was 12. Mom busied herself reorganizing the pantry, the linen closet, even the attic. Like neat rows of canned beans and folded sheets could reassemble a life crumbling quietly under her hands. I let them retreat. I didn't chase them down for explanations or apologies that would never come. Instead, I signed the lease on a small apartment across town. 2 bedrooms, sunlight pooling across worn hardwood floors, enough space for books and plants, and dreams too big to be contained by walls soaked in old betrayals. I packed my things, slowly, methodically, stacking memories into boxes with hands that didn't shake anymore. The day I moved out, I didn't announce it. I didn't stage a grand farewell. I simply loaded my car, tucked the last box into the back seat, and walked through the house one final time. The rooms felt smaller than I remembered. Smaller than the space I had finally claimed inside myself. In the living room, Mom stood stiffly by the fireplace, arms crossed. Dad sat in his recliner, flipping through a newspaper he clearly wasn't reading. Neither of them looked up as I passed. Neither said goodbye. I didn't offer one either. Some endings don't need punctuation. They just stop. I closed the front door behind me with a soft click, the sound quiet but absolute, not a slam, not a crash, just a final breath, a finished chapter. As I drove toward my new beginning, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, I realized something simple and stunning. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't even relieved. I was free. And freedom, it turned out, didn't roar, it whispered, it settled, it stayed. My new apartment wasn't much by the standards Sophia would have posted online, or the way Mom once measured success in granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, but to me, it was a palace. The paint peeled slightly near the bathroom door, the radiator clanked like a tired drummer when the heat kicked on, and the floorboards creaked a little too enthusiastically at night, but it was mine. Every inch of it breathed with the stubborn, grateful air of someone who had survived being erased and built something beautiful from the ruins. The first night I slept there, I left the windows open despite the chill. I let the city noises drift in, cars humming, dogs barking, someone laughing too loudly 2 streets over, and I curled under a worn quilt on my mattress, tucked against the far wall. I thought about all the nights spent lying awake in that house, feeling like an unwelcome guest in my own story. And I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, it was a quiet, tired, deeply rooted thing that didn't need witnesses or approval to be real. At work, things shifted too. Mrs. Alvarez offered me a paid position coordinating outreach programs after seeing the way I handled the food drive with military precision and a kind heart. I said yes before she finished asking. I updated my resume at the local library, squeezing the pride down to bullet points and modest phrases, even as my heart shouted with every keystroke. I bought secondhand office clothes from a thrift store downtown, proud of every blouse and blazer patched together by my own hands and stubbornness. Sophia texted a few times. I didn't block her, but I didn't reply either. Her messages varied between awkward jokes about childhood memories and vague apologies sprinkled with too many exclamation points, like enthusiasm could scrub away years of looking the other way. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't foolish either. Healing didn't mean reopening doors just because someone knocked louder. Healing meant choosing which doors stayed locked, which bridges remained ash in the river. Mom emailed once. It was short, painfully formal, almost a business transaction in tone. We hope you're well. The house is staying off the market for now. Please know you're welcome back anytime. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before closing the laptop without responding. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't bitter. I simply understood now that some invitations are written not out of love, but out of loneliness. And loneliness, as brutal as it feels, isn't the same as change. It's just the echo of choices, finally catching up. The days fell into a rhythm so steady it felt like breathing, simple and vital. I woke early, brewed strong coffee in the tiny kitchen that smelled like toasted bread and quiet beginnings, and walked to the community center with the kind of calm that doesn't need ceremony to feel sacred. I helped children with homework, organized food drives, and learned how to stretch a dollar until it sang. On weekends, I wandered the city with a battered secondhand camera, snapping photos of graffiti art, blooming alleyway gardens, old women laughing on cracked front steps. Life didn't roar like it used to. It hummed low and steady in my chest. A song I finally knew the words to. One Friday afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez pulled me into her office, her smile wide and proud. She handed me an envelope with a grant award letter inside, funding a pilot program I had proposed months ago, a mentorship initiative for at-risk girls. I sat in the rickety plastic chair, blinking down at the words, feeling something crack open gently inside my ribs. Not the shattering kind of breaking I knew too well, but a softer kind. Like spring thawing ice after a too long winter. I had built something. I had earned something. And no one could take it away with a signature or a smile. I celebrated quietly that night with a dollar store candle stuck into a brownie, singing to myself in the kitchen while the radiator rattled along like an old friend keeping time. I danced barefoot on the scuffed linoleum floor, spinning until I was dizzy, until laughter cracked out of me like a prayer I didn't even realize I had been holding back. Sir Whiskerton meowed in protest from his perch on the windowsill, and I scooped him up, spinning him in the air while he howled like he was part of the celebration too. Around midnight, my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Sophia. Thinking of you. Hope you're okay. Short. Small. Tentative. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, not out of spite, but because sometimes silence is the loudest boundary you can draw. I tucked my phone face down and curled up under my quilt, Sir Whiskerton a heavy, grumbling weight against my legs, and drifted to sleep with a heart that wasn't empty anymore, but full and steady and entirely my own. Fall slid into winter almost without warning, the first frost dusting the sidewalks like powdered sugar on a cake. I bought a second-hand coat 2 sizes too big but warm enough to wrap around both myself and Sir Whiskerton when he insisted on coming with me to the corner bodega. At the center, our mentorship program launched and I watched shy, guarded girls bloom into something fierce and bright under a few months of stubborn attention and gentle hands. Every success was stitched from late nights, scraped knees, and the kind of hope that doesn't sparkle on greeting cards but hums quietly under your skin. Sophia showed up one Saturday morning as I was setting up tables for the center's winter fundraiser. She wore a parka 2 seasons old and sneakers scuffed at the toes, a stark contrast to the glossy Instagram-perfect outfits she used to flaunt. She stood at the doorway like a child left out in the cold, hands wringing a knit hat she didn't seem to realize she was holding. "Eva," she said, her voice raw, unguarded. "Can I help?" I stared at her for a long moment, long enough for the walls inside me to shift slightly, long enough for the sharp edge of anger to soften into something quieter. I nodded toward a stack of folding chairs. "Those need setting up," I said simply, nothing more, nothing less. She smiled then, a small, relieved thing, and got to work without another word. We didn't talk much as we moved around the room, arranging chairs and stringing up paper snowflakes the kids had made earlier that week. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It wasn't angry. It was just space. Space big enough for something different to grow if we both let it. And maybe, just maybe, we would. But I wasn't rushing it. Some bridges need to be rebuilt plank by careful plank, and this time, I wasn't the only one doing the heavy lifting. That night, after the fundraiser closed and the last of the volunteers drifted away into the snowy evening, Sophia hesitated by the door. She glanced back at me, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Ava." I don't know if I ever said that before, but I am. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I just smiled, tired but genuine, and nodded. "Thanks," I said. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The first snowstorm of the season came the following weekend, blanketing the city in a hush so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. I sat by my window, wrapped in a worn blanket watching snowflakes drift past the streetlights like lazy ghosts. Across the street, a little boy built a crooked snowman, his mittens flailing with every slap of snow. Life felt smaller now, quieter, but in a way that felt deliberate rather than lonely. Every crack in the walls, every creak in the floors, every chipped teacup felt earned, a testament to a life I had built from the bones up. Sophia texted once. A picture of the fundraiser's thank you plaque hung proudly in the center's hallway. "You did good," she wrote. Simple. Honest. No apologies. No promises. And maybe that was better. Mom and Dad didn't reach out. I didn't expect them to. Their silence no longer stung the way it once had. It wasn't a knife now, just an empty room I had long since walked out of without bothering to shut the door behind me. Let them live with the echoes if they chose to. I wasn't waiting for a knock anymore. I spent Christmas Eve at the center, stringing up paper lanterns and handing out hot chocolate to wide-eyed kids bundled in coats too thin for the biting wind. Sophia was there too, laughing quietly as she helped wrap donated toys in garish holiday paper. Somewhere between taping the corners of a crooked box and sipping burnt cocoa from a styrofoam cup, we smiled at each other across the room, not as enemies, not even as sisters rebuilding a ruined bridge, but simply as two women choosing to show up when it mattered most. Later that night, curled on my couch with Sir Whiskerton purring at my feet, I realized something that made me laugh softly into the dark. I had spent so long believing survival meant clenching my fists, standing rigid against the storms. But real survival, it turned out, was quieter than that. It was about learning when to loosen your grip, when to lay down the sword, when to choose peace without needing to make a sound about it. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need anything from them anymore. I'd chosen myself. And for the first time, that choice didn't feel like an act of war. It felt like coming home. January dawned gray and brittle, the kind of month that tests your patience more than your resolve. The community center buzzed with new plans and fresh faces, each person carrying dreams heavier than their worn backpacks and too thin jackets. I threw myself into the work. Not to forget, not to bury, but because building something had become as natural to me as breathing. Every event organized, every grant proposal written, every smile coaxed from a shy child felt like laying another brick on a foundation no storm could wash away. At night, I sat by the window, reading scholarship brochures for programs I never would have dared apply to before. Columbia. Northwestern. Programs for women rebuilding after adversity. For first-generation students, for those who had clawed their futures out of broken promises. I wasn't sure I belonged yet, but I was starting to believe maybe I could. Belief, I was learning, wasn't a thunderclap, it was a quiet, persistent tapping, a door you built yourself and dared to walk through, even when your hands still shook. One chilly evening, Mrs. Alvarez invited me to speak at a citywide conference about the mentorship program. I almost said no out of habit, out of the smallness that still sometimes wrapped around my ribs like a too-tight sweater. But Sophie's quiet pride and the thought of all the girls watching pushed me forward. I stood on a stage in a drafty auditorium, hands trembling slightly as I gripped the podium, and told my story. Not the polished version, not the version that fit neatly onto a social media post. The real one. About disappointment. About betrayal. About building something beautiful anyway. When I finished, the applause rolled over me like sunlight after a long winter. People came up afterward, strangers with soft eyes and firm handshakes, telling me they saw themselves in my story. That it mattered, that it made them believe, even if just for a moment, that they could survive too. I walked home that night with my head high, boots crunching through old snow, heart light in a way it hadn't been for as long as I could remember. No one could erase this. No one could stamp it out or twist it into something smaller. It was mine, every shaky word, every bloody step forward, every stubborn, beautiful breath. Spring came slowly. The tulips Sophie and I planted outside the center poked green shoots through the frozen dirt, defiant and foolish and brave. She named them after constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, Vega. We built a tiny universe out of flower beds and faith. I filed my final college application with a laugh, daring the world to tell me no when I had already learned how to build doors out of denial. Mom called once, in late March. I let it ring out. There was nothing left to say. Some chapters don't end in fire, they just stop, and that's enough. I didn't hate her. I didn't hate Dad. I didn't even hate Sophia. Hatred was too heavy to carry where I was going. I chose peace. I chose myself. I chose a future that wasn't built on borrowed approval or secondhand dreams. And for the first time, standing on a cracked sidewalk in a too small city under a too wide sky, I realized I didn't just survive them, I outgrew them. I used to think freedom was loud, that it came with declarations and slammed doors, with triumphant speeches and headlines that shouted your name across the skyline. But real freedom, I learned, slips in quietly. It hums low under your skin, steady and warm, unnoticed by anyone except yourself. It tastes like coffee brewed in a kitchen no one else owns. It feels like laughter that doesn't check the room first. It moves like a river, cutting through stone, slow and certain and unstoppable. I don't know if Sophia ever truly understood why I chose silence instead of reconciliation. I don't know if Mom still rewrites history in her mind until she can live with it. I don't know if Dad still believes strength is measured by how loudly you speak or how tightly you cling to what was never truly yours. Maybe they changed. Maybe they didn't. It doesn't matter anymore, because their stories are no longer mine to carry. Their apologies, or the lack of them, aren't weights around my ankles. Their expectations aren't maps I have to follow blindfolded anymore. I wrote my own ending, the one they never imagined for me. I wrote it in small kindnesses and stubborn dreams, in late nights at the community center, in scholarship essays typed with shaking hands and relentless hope. I wrote it every morning I chose to get up and build a life no one thought I deserved. I wrote it every time I loved myself louder than their silence. I didn't need a final confrontation. I didn't need them to say sorry. I didn't need them to clap for me when I finally stood taller than they ever allowed. I needed only this, the quiet certainty that I am enough. And that is louder than anything they could have said.